case.
Well, as a good Jesuit, I did not follow directions. I'm not speaking on gratitude tonight. So if you want to hear about gratitude, invite me back. Sorry. It seems perfectly apparent to me that it should be about gratitude, you who make this work possible. Nevertheless, what I chose for my topic, thinking that it was going to be mostly people who are working as Ignatian volunteers, you're part of the Jesuit family. You're part of the larger Ignatian family. And so I wanted to reflect with you a little bit about the Jesuits' journey in service to the poor. What we have learned. We're almost 500 years old. We're about 470 something, 1541, whoever can do the math. So we've learned a few things about working with the poor, some of which you are benefiting from because Jim Connery and Charlie Costello really came immersed in all of that experience that the Jesuits have had. But before I do, since Jim mentioned when I was pastor in Camden, it was a poor inner city parish, Hispanic, drugs, gangs. There are several of the high schools here in the DC area who send children up there students, adolescents, up for immersion programs. I lived it every day. And we had two volunteers, as Jim says. One has been Ignatian volunteer, not Jesuit. We had both, Jesuit volunteers and Ignatian volunteers. We had two Ignatian volunteers, one who was there almost from the beginning of IVC, John Trumbore, does an amazing work. However, I was more indebted to the other man, Dennis Diamond. I was in a parish where we had an untrained bookkeeper. We had no money coming in, whatever came in through donations, but nothing was generated locally. And every time I had to send some report to the diocese, what's our proposed budget, or how did we end the last year, it would be maybe 2 pages, and it would come back from the diocese with 6 pages of comments. What did you mean by this? This doesn't make sense. These figures don't add up. And so I went to IVC and I said, this is my predicament. Do you have anybody? Dennis Diamond came. He was my own age. He was an early retiree. And he came. It took him 3 years to figure out everything because we had a school, a legal clinic, a medical clinic, a social work clinic, and a parish. So each one had its own books. And it took Dennis 3 years to work through and train the woman that we had all those years, who was a wonderful, wonderful person, but she didn't have any formal training. Dennis did all of that for us. So I said, I will always be indebted to the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. I remember one of my last meetings at the diocese was the CFO for the diocese was getting up and really kind of complaining that pastors were not doing reports either in a timely fashion or following the rules. And he said, let me tell you about a parish that does everything right. It's Holy Name Parish, the Jesuit parish, and that was all because of Ignatian. So I felt vindicated. I mean, really, that was a great story for me. But I mean, the work that Dennis did there was painstaking. It was going out, teasing out, where did this money come from? Why was this money put over here? It really was wonderful, wonderful work. Something that we could not have done with the people on our staff, nor could we have paid anybody else to come in and do it. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Society of Jesus and our experience of providing service for the poor and what we have learned over these almost 500 years. And I thought I would do that because it might give some opportunity for reflection for you as Ignatian volunteers. How much of this fits with you, how much is a parallel to you, and how much of it doesn't have anything to do with you at all. So, some history first of all. You know who the founder of the Jesuits is? St. Ignatius Loyola, 1541. one of the very first works that the Jesuits undertook, before we ever had any schools, that's what everybody knows us for, the schools, right? Before we had any schools, Ignatius founded a house in the middle of Rome called Casa Santa Marta, the place where the Pope lives now. Has nothing to do with that Casa Santa Marta. It was a house for prostitutes whom he had rescued from the street. And from the very beginning, he said, this is the kind of work that Jesuits should be doing. We should work with the poor and for the poor. He recognized that this was not a situation of moral degradation, the fact that these women had been working in the sex trade. He said, this is an economic reality. And so we're going to provide this house for them that will be a safe place. And it's not just giving them what they need, their food and shelter, their clothing, whatever else. We will equip them for a life after Casa Santa Marta. And so he began with vocational training, lace making, and just housekeeping skills so that they could find a job later on. The second thing he did was, as Mary and Joni and the rest of you who do fundraising know, that's how you keep an organization going. He created a group of benefactors who would provide money for dowries for these women. So now they could go out and get married. So some of them got married, some of them were trained as housekeepers and were able to find jobs, and some of them just said, we want to stay here. We don't want to do anything else. So that was Ignatius saying, this is the kind of work that we should be doing. After a while, it seems that we got so involved in schools that certain Jesuits continued to do work like Casa Santa Marta, or like St. Peter Claver working with the slaves in Colombia, or St. Aloysius Gonzaga going out and working among the plague victims there in Rome. But most of the Jesuits got involved in schoolwork, and that really became their entire focus against the wishes of Ignatius. So we had to learn something. Move forward several hundred years. There's a man, Horace McKenna, whom most of you would know. Anybody who doesn't know Horace? Horace, a Jesuit priest, born 1899, but spent the better part of his life in the counties, southern Maryland, and then sometime in Philadelphia in the inner city, and then at Gonzaga High School, St. Aloysius Gonzaga Parish. Started out as a parish priest, and then realized before the Vatican Council and before the Jesuits caught up with him, that you can't attend to people's spiritual needs and neglect their material needs. And Horace was doing that for a number of years there at 19 I Street, just out of the back door of the rectory. Did it for a number of years, and then realized, and this is a piece of the evolution in what we learned now as Jesuits, you can't sustain a good work without having an institution. I heard that in the stories that you're telling tonight when you said, I'm doing work in this place, I'm doing work in that place. It wouldn't happen if there were not the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. You need something that keeps it going so that when you cycle off, somebody else will cycle on. So that in order for you to be able to do the work that you're doing, somebody's helping with the expenses. So Horace learned that, and we know some, so others may eat. Other organizations that Horace was involved with others, collaborated with others, so that the work of the corporal works of mercy could continue and not just the spiritual works of mercy. So that's the first thing that we learned. If you have a good program going, no matter how good it is, you need an institution behind you, and an institution requires lots of people behind it. Second thing that we learned, and this has not always been popular. The way I used Horace for this example, I want to use someone that Pedro will certainly be familiar with, Father Alberto Hurtado. Anybody know that name, Alberto Hurtado? Mm-hmm. Alberto Hurtado, Jesuit priest, born 1 year after Horace McKenna, or 2 years after Horace McKenna, but he died in 1952. early on. Chilean Jesuit, assigned to teach at the Catholic University and at the Jesuit prep school in town. And little by little, just as Horace did, he just began to notice people on the streets, especially young boys who were homeless, living under the bridges. And every night after classes, Alberto used to go out and just drive around town and bring blankets, bring clothing, and all the rest. And then he did what Horace did. He said, if this is going to continue, there has to be an institution. So as Horace worked with So Others May Eat, Alberto Hurtado started Hogar de Cristo, the home of Christ, which now is a national institution in Chile, much larger than any Catholic institution proportionally here in the United States. So that piece of learning that there has to be an institution behind it is something that has kind of traveled around the world. The other thing, though, that Alberto Hurtado did that Horace never really did, Horace would stand up at city council meetings and Horace would browbeat many people about what is wrong with our society, but Horace never learned to focus that voice. Alberto Hurtado did. He said, if we're going to be addressing these ills, we cannot just be doing Band-Aid work. We have to analyze what are the root causes of these problems, and we have to make this known. And so he founded a journal of thought and opinion, similar to America Magazine, if you're familiar with here, Mensaje, which is still continuing today. And so that was and continues to be a journal of thought about what's happening in Chile and in the world. But it originally started as, this is what's wrong with our country socially, our country of Chile. This is what's wrong socially. So it was a voice of criticism, analysis and criticism. And I think we've learned that as Jesuits. If we're going to continue in this work of service of the poor, it cannot just be direct service, which most of you are doing, direct service to the poor. Wonderful, it's a starting point. Secondly, there has to be an institutionalization. But we think as Jesuits that there also has to be analysis of why these problems exist and criticism when it is necessary. Alberto Hurtado was immensely popular during his lifetime. He was able to get away with it, but you can imagine that all the alumni coming out of Jesuit schools were not pleased. Not every alumnus was pleased with the kind of criticism, social criticism that was coming out. And he said, it doesn't matter. We're going to lose some, but many others will come. And that's the truth. So we learned those two things. Horace was working in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way up to his death in 1980-something. Father Hurtado died in 1951. 20 years later than that was, even before that, the Vatican Council. The Vatican Council is the first time that as a church, as a universal church, we recognize that it's important for us to be involved in the ordinary lives of people and not just be concerned about how they live the sacraments. Just that one little quote here from the document on the church in the modern world. The joys and hopes, the griefs and anguish of the people of our time, especially of those who are poor and afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anguish of the followers of Christ as well. The church is recognizing, really, if not for the first time in the modern era, that this is the things that we should be concerned about. 6 years later, the Synod of Bishops, the first time that the bishops around the world meet after the council. They come up with a document that's called The Justice in the World, and it has become central. Their document has become central to the work of Catholics all around the world. And it says that action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world appear to us as a constitutive dimension of preaching the gospel.